something that I find so important. And obviously, right now, we're going through an interesting era when it comes to economic prosperity. But economic prosperity is fundamental to our lives and livelihoods, to getting the most out of our lives. How is the United States leveling up when it comes to prosperity, and not just as a country, but also in terms of the 50 states that constitute the United States of America? There is a new report out from the Legatum Institute out of the UK, which is called the U.S. Prosperity Index. And the U.S. Prosperity Index is an interesting way of measuring among the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and measuring how our states are all lining up, whether you're here in Colorado, where we're located, which is the 8th state, or you're in New York or California or Texas or wherever. So it's an interesting metric of that. And I am very pleased today to have with us, live from the UK, the director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute, Shaun Flanagan. He is, again, director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute based out of the UK, and he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Shaun, sir, welcome to the program.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. If it's possible, you can lower your camera a little bit. That would be great. I appreciate it. We just noticed a little high. Okay. Now it's a little low. Yeah, that's just right. That's perfect. Shaun, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Welcome to the show. How are you doing? How are things over in the UK amidst all this?
Yeah, well, like you guys on the other side of the pond, you know, we're facing some challenging times at the moment, but yeah, we're sort of battling on and trying to continue with the good work that we're doing here, despite of it all.
Absolutely. Well, and you have to keep on keeping on, especially when it comes to providing interesting and important, valuable information to policymakers. So tell us a little bit about the Legatum Institute and what you guys have done with the U.S. Prosperity Index. Let's jump right to it.
Sure, very happy to, Jimmy. So we at the Legatum Institute, we've been in existence for about 13 years. And we were very much created, the sort of vision and passion behind the original founders was about creating or helping create the pathways from poverty to prosperity. So helping lift people out of poverty. But when we talk about prosperity, we mean a combination of economic and social well-being, and those two things working hand in hand that really does lead to a life truly flourishing. I think often prosperity is considered just in terms of wealth or financial aspects, but we believe both of those things, economic and social well-being, are important. So we've developed our global prosperity index and have been measuring and tracking prosperity across the globe for about 13 years. One of the fascinating things that we find when we look at the index is when we look at the US, the United States, we find that, as you'd expect, on the economic aspects of the index, the US does exceptionally well. It ranks 4th out of 167 countries on open economies. But when you look at the other two dimensions of the index, that's around inclusive societies and empowered people, we see that actually it performs 21st or ranks 21st and 27th accordingly on those two domains. And so overall, the US slips down to 18th in the rankings of prosperity. Of course, that's still very good, but we wanted to understand what was happening across the US that was leading to that. So we developed the USPI, which has allowed us to interrogate and understand the level of prosperity across the US in the 50 states and Washington, D.C.
Now, Shaun Flanagan, in the Prosperity Index, you look at 11 different pillars of prosperity: business environment, market access and infrastructure, economic quality, safety and security, personal freedom, governance, social capital, living conditions, education, health, and natural environment. Obviously, there are a lot there. There are 11. We could spend hours, I'm sure, going through each of these particular categories. But one thing that I think is striking here is that you have an interesting mix. There are a lot of different aspects. So maybe if you could just pick a couple that you think are fairly conventional when people think of prosperity and what can be metrics of prosperity, and a couple that might be surprising and why they're included.
Sure. So I think if you look at the economic domains, that's the first three pillars you mentioned. Economic quality really is about one that you'd expect to be in there, which is around the extent to which a country, or in this case a state, can generate wealth sustainably for the benefit of all, but also including all. So that's looking at things like employment rates, labour force participation, sort of inflation and GDP growth. So that kind of thing you'd probably expect to be in there. Also, when you're looking at the prosperity of individuals, you'd consider things like education, how well is education being delivered across a state, and also the health. What is health like? And obviously, at the moment, against the backdrop in which we find ourselves, that is super important. But perhaps some of the other things which are a little bit less or a bit unconventional, perhaps, are things like personal freedom, the extent to which people have a sort of basic legal rights, their sort of liberties, the ability to the social tolerance that exists around certain groups of societies, and the social capital pillar, which is one that we have worked with an expert in the US, a guy called Scott Winship, who actually has helped us shape that particular aspect. And that's almost like the glue of society. It measures the strength of relationships between friends and family members, but also trust in strangers, trust in institutions, and the extent to which people engage and participate in civic society.
One thing I find so striking, so when you say trust in institutions, this is something I've been observing. Here in the United States right now, we are at a low, at least for decades, I think, in trust in institutions, from politicians and government at the federal level especially, but also even state and local levels in many cases. Also when it comes to the media, even religious institutions, other institutions in society. And if you don't have that kind of trust in existing institutions, that can lead to some very difficult challenges for social cohesion, which can also in turn lead to challenges for prosperity. Expand on that one for a little bit, Shaun Flanagan.
Yeah, well, we definitely saw that. And so when we published this report last year, we had some sort of macro findings which were sort of relevant to the whole of the US. And then obviously had individual findings which were relevant to individual states. But one of those macro findings was around the decline in social capital over the past decade in the US. And the US is not unique in that. We find that in developed nations. So when we published our Global Prosperity Report in November, that was one of the key findings in the UK, is that social capital has also declined. But it's as people, perhaps almost withdraw from society a little bit, are less engaged, less involved in society and participating in ensuring that society moves forward around civic and social engagement. But the trust in institutions and the media is also something that we saw decline and deteriorate. And we see that as a challenge to prosperity in the US, and one of those areas that ideally would be reversed.
Again, we're talking with Shaun Flanagan, who is director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute in the United Kingdom. Shaun, let's talk for a moment about education and health and how you guys look at that in these prosperity indices, particularly because, look, here in the United States, we have a very different healthcare system than you do in the UK. I'm someone who prefers our private sector-based healthcare system, although I think there are a heck of a lot of issues, cost being among them, but I'm a believer in government being the root of the problem here. How do you guys, though, approach health and education, especially when you're looking at systems that can be very different?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So it's probably worthwhile saying, Jimmy, just for a little bit around the index. So if you think of the index basically as a pyramid, at the apex of the pyramid, you've got overall prosperity. Underneath that, you've got these three domains: open economies, inclusive societies, and empowered people. Underneath that, as you've said, you've got the 11 pillars. Underneath that, sitting under each pillar is a number of what we call policy-focused elements. So we believe that's the strategic way in to understanding where prosperity is either weak or strong. And we've developed those with around 40 experts in the US to help really inform policymakers' decisions and state legislators, etc., see where they need to invest time and resources. At the very lowest level, the bottom of the pyramid, we've got 215 indicators, each of which are bundled together into these policy-focused elements. So if we're looking at education and health, and forgive me, I will just take the opportunity of looking
by all means
here.
Not a problem. And while you're looking for the report, let me just remind folks that Shaun Flanagan is director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute, and we're talking about the Prosperity Index, especially in particular the U.S. Prosperity Index, a very interesting report that Legatum has come out with, and it looks like he's probably identified the page. I'm open.
I'm there, and if I may, Jimmy, just on the
by all means.
all of findings and results are published and freely available on our website, usprosperity.net. And if people are interested in their particular state, there is a state profile for every single state, which will provide that pyramid structure I just talked about, where your state is now, how it's improved over the past decade, and you can really drill down to see the areas of strength and weakness. But when we look at education, I mentioned that when we constructed the index, to your point, we are a London-based think tank with a global remit, but we recognise that whilst we're expert on data and indexes, we're not necessarily experts on all the issues in the US. So we did draw upon 40 US experts to help advise us on the construction of the index and which data sources we should use. But education, they helped inform us, is sort of broken down into mainly the key stages that people go through. So you have like pre-primary education, you then have primary education, high school education is the next element. They're the first three elements. We then look at tertiary education around sort of universities and post-secondary education. And then the final thing we capture is the extent of the skills in the adult workforce. So how many people have a bachelor's degree or at least a high school diploma. But in each of those elements, what we capture is how many people go into the system, so enrollment, how many graduate and complete, so you're checking, are people going all the way through? But then also really important is what is the quality of the education that they receive? So we capture things like test scores in primary and secondary education to really understand that whole holistic aspect of education. So all those things brought together capture education. And then on health, health is a little bit different. What we try and do here is the first element we capture is what is the behavioral risk factors of the population. So there we're looking at things like obesity, smoking, alcohol use, pain-related disorder, etc. We're looking also then at the preventive interventions. So this is the way in which society sort of helps people avoid poor health. So regular visits to the dentist, to the doctor, child immunization, medical visits, immunization, certain tests, pap smear tests, for example. The next thing we then capture is the quality of the care system. So this looks at things like hospital ratings. We do also look at things like adults with no healthcare coverage. If they're particularly at risk.
Just kind of get into the crux of it is there are a variety of different factors that go into these, which I think is very interesting because what it does is it provides a whole slew of data points that you can be looking at for comparison as far as outcomes, for example, that aren't necessarily tied to the specific policies. And perhaps somebody could make a judgment themselves on, even though you do get into policy a little bit, on what best to do in order to improve policy in the country so that those outcomes get better.
Absolutely. So we've tried to create these policy-focused elements so that it really helps guide and direct where, you know, if a state is performing poorly on health, for example, it probably isn't performing across the board poorly on health. There will be certain areas, and the index allows those areas to be sourced to help inform what might be the most appropriate policy response.
Sure. And this is something that I think is very important. So, Shaun Flanagan, you and Stephen Bryan, also with the Legatum Institute, wrote an op-ed for townhall.com, and you say this towards the end. Although priority areas and strategic approaches will necessarily vary, it is clear that state-level political will has much to contribute to the development of prosperity across the U.S. Now, I want to underscore this point as we start to wind down our conversation, because here in the U.S., federalism is a very important component of our society. It's intrinsic to the U.S. Constitution, and the idea of laboratories of democracy is something that people across this country know and understand as being rooted in the states. So I would love for you to expand on that, which helps underscore, too, why you would want to focus on a U.S. prosperity index looking at the 50 states plus the District of Columbia as opposed to just one lump sum, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the macro findings that we found in the USPI was, unlike in the global index, if you look at all the countries at the top of the global index, they generally perform well across all the different pillars of prosperity. And those at the bottom perform poorly on all different pillars. We don't see that in the US. What we see in the US is that no single state succeeds in providing both economic and social, full economic and social well-being for all its residents. In other words, every single state performs below ranking 20th in at least one or more of the pillars. So we see that as a real opportunity for each state to improve in one particular area, but also that where one state is perhaps underperforming in an area, another state is performing strongly. And what is the opportunity for shared collaboration and learning? So what are they doing that would enable another state to perhaps learn and benefit from similar policy initiatives? And the index provides that sort of lens, as it were, to be able to see where those strengths and weaknesses are across the states.
And final question, because we haven't actually singled out individual states, what's on the top of the list? What's at the bottom of the list?
What would you think might be at the top, Jimmy?
Oh my gosh, I don't even want to venture to guess, because then I will offend somebody who's watching by my... How could you just make that sort of presumption? I'd rather just go to the data.
Okay, absolutely. So we find at the top that Massachusetts is at the top, and Mississippi is at the bottom. We find that there's a number of states in the northeast that do well on the index, but they're not universal in sharing top places. We also find that places like Washington State, but also Utah, Colorado, they also perform in the top 10. So when you bundle together all of those 215 indicators, they're the ones that come out at the top, and as I say, Mississippi towards the bottom. I would like also just to say, Jimmy,
Sure.
We're updating the index at the moment, and we'll be publishing another year's worth of data and analysis in the summer. We're also doing a county level index for 8 selected states. We recognize that these states are large and they contain huge disparities. So we want to unpack and understand that. And we're doing that initially just through 8 states, just because of the volume of work involved. But that will be published in the summer at the same time.
And I am guessing, as a final question, Shaun Flanagan, that among the top 10 states and among the bottom 10 states or localities, wherever you include Washington, D.C., that the factors that put them at that point on the list may be very different. So you may have states that are in the top 10 that have different aspects to the index that they score high on that make them among the top 10. So it's not like the top 10 are filled with people who score, or states that score really well on healthcare and education.
Yeah.
There might be a mix of them.
Absolutely. And that's where this opportunity for shared learning and collaboration is because if you look across the ranking tables at the top 10, for example, you will see where one state is strong, another state nearby is performing poorly. And so there is that opportunity for shared learning.
Sure. Shaun Flanagan, Director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute. Very fascinating report, very fascinating discussion. Folks can be sure to check it out at usprosperity.net. That's usprosperity.net. Thanks so much for joining us from across the pond. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Jimmy, for having me on. Take care.
Thank you. You as well. Best wishes and stay healthy. Again, we've been talking with Shaun Flanagan, Director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute over in the UK. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.